On April 29, 1945, units from the 157th Infantry Regiment advanced toward a walled complex on the outskirts of Munich. The preliminary reconnaissance did not anticipate any confrontation. What they found, however, was a scene beyond the parameters of conventional warfare: 39 wagons full of decomposing corpses. A few meters away, the crematorium ovens were still operating. The camp held 32,000 prisoners, many on the brink of death. Some SS guards had piled their weapons, others were still watching from active towers. There was no clear German command nor Allied protocols for such a situation. A low-ranking officer offered the surrender with no documents or clear orders. What made the soldiers identify the guards as legitimate targets? Who decided to open fire on already surrendered men? And why were these actions not punished as war crimes? At Dachau, the hell discovered by Allied troops. On April 29, 1945, elements of the 45th Thunderbird Infantry Division and the 42nd Rainbow Division of the 7th U.S. Army were advancing toward Munich when their reconnaissance units reported the presence of a walled complex with watchtowers. The approach to what would turn out to be the Dachau concentration camp was not part of a specific objective, but rather part of the general progress toward the Bavarian capital. Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks, commanding the 157th Infantry Regiment, ordered a tactical deployment around the perimeter. During this initial reconnaissance, the discovery of an abandoned railway convoy on the outskirts of the camp would irreversibly mark the character of the day. In 39 freight cars lay more than 2,000 corpses in an advanced state of decomposition. This transport, coming from the Buchenwald camp, had been sent weeks earlier as a part of evacuations due to the Allied advance. Most of the prisoners had died of starvation, dehydration, or suffocation during a journey that was prolonged abnormally due to bombings and the German logistical collapse. The news of the macabre discovery spread quickly among the US ranks. Soldiers battle-hardened in Italy and France reacted with deep shock at this first evidence of Nazi crimes. Sergeant William Cowling of the 42nd Division documented in his diary, "There are no words to describe it. The smell was unbearable, but even more unbearable was understanding that this had been carried out methodically by other human beings." The entry to the main camp was not made through an armed assault. Around noon, a delegation appeared at the main gate with a white flag. Swiss Victor Maurer, a representative of the International Red Cross, accompanied Heinrich Wicker, a young SS officer of only 23 years who had been left in charge after the higher hierarchy fled. Wicker offered the formal surrender to Brigadier General Henning Linden of the 42nd Division, who agreed to receive the capitulation on behalf of the United States Army. Maurer warned about the presence of approximately 32,000 prisoners, many infected with typhus and in critical condition. He also mentioned that about 100 guards had piled their weapons, although several watchtowers remained active. With these warnings, the troops cautiously advanced inward. The scene that was revealed exceeded any expectations. The barracks, originally designed to house 500 prisoners, contained up to 5 times that amount. Thousands of skeletal human beings in striped uniforms crawled toward the Americans, many too weak to stand. Hunger, disease, and despair had transformed the camp into a threshold between life and death. Captain Howard Wilsey, one of the first medical professionals to enter, documented with clinical precision what was found: severe generalized malnutrition, hunger edema, epidemic typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Most have lost between 40% and 60% of their normal body mass. Many show signs of injuries from medical experiments. The crematorium complex, located in a separate area from the main camp, perhaps constituted the most explicit testimony to the extermination system. Built in 1942 and expanded in 1943, it had 4 industrial furnaces specifically designed for the incineration of human bodies. When the American troops entered, the furnaces were actively working, with partially charred human remains inside. Operations technician Maximilian Grabner had been ordered to keep the furnaces running continuously for the 48 hours prior to eliminate as much evidence as possible. Next to the crematorium, an administrative building housed detailed records of processing, a euphemism for executions and cremations. Meticulously organized accounting books documented identification numbers, dates, and falsified causes of death. Only in April 1945, These records indicated more than 4,000 processings, with peaks of up to 250 bodies in a single day during the week leading up to liberation. The medical experiment zone, located in a building officially designated as the research hospital, revealed further horrors. The US medical staff documented rooms equipped for hypothermia procedures where prisoners were submerged in ice-cold water to study the limits of human endurance. Other facilities contained equipment for atmospheric pressure experimentation, disease inoculation, and tests of resistance to poisons. Dr. Josef Hintermeyer, a Czech medical prisoner freed that day, provided immediate testimony about the experimentation protocols. They mainly selected robust prisoners to determine how much suffering a healthy body could endure before collapsing. The results were sent weekly to Berlin as formal scientific reports. In the adjacent morgue, soldiers discovered bodies of prisoners with various surgical mutilations, experimental amputations, organ extractions, and evidence of chemical agent testing. Some bodies showed signs of recent autopsies, apparently performed just hours before the arrival of the American troops. This convergence of elements, wagons with corpses, dying prisoners, an active crematorium, and evidence of experimentation, created a devastating psychological impact. The physical horror quickly transformed into barely contained rage against those responsible. While medical teams began the impossible task of attending to thousands of survivors, another darker dynamic began to develop at various points within the camp. Surrender or deception, the chaos inside Dachau. The surrender of the Dachau camp did not follow conventional military protocol. There were no formal documents nor an orderly transfer of authority, but rather a collision between a collapsing Nazi system and Allied troops without specific guidelines on how to manage a discovery of this nature. The German chain of command was fractured. The official commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Eduard Weiter, had abandoned his post 3 days earlier, fleeing to Tyrol. Heinrich Wicker, the officer who offered the surrender, was a subordinate with no full authority over the complex. This disintegration of Nazi control was reflected in fundamental contradictions on the ground. Victor Maurer, the Swiss Red Cross delegate, had arrived at Dachau the previous day with the intention of facilitating a peaceful transition. He succeeded in convincing Wicker not to carry out orders for the final evacuation, a euphemism for the mass murder of prisoners, and to offer the surrender to the approaching troops. The ambiguity of the situation manifested in critical discrepancies regarding the presence of guards within the camp. Wicker mentioned approximately 100 men who had stacked their weapons, a number significantly lower than the reality. Later reports from the 157th Regiment estimated between 300 and 560 SS members scattered throughout the complex, including satellite fields and external posts. This inconsistency was not accidental. Many guards, anticipating reprisals, had discarded their black uniforms for civilian clothes or regular Wehrmacht uniforms. Others remained in watchtowers, undecided between surrendering or resisting. This fragmented surrender created a dangerous tactical ambiguity. The American soldiers could not clearly distinguish between surrendered guards and potential active threats. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead of the 45th Division described the confusion. "We were ordered to advance with maximum caution. We were informed of a general surrender, but also that hostile elements might remain active. Several towers were still occupied. We didn't know if we were walking into a trap or a truly surrendered camp." The situation was complicated by the absence of specific protocols for liberating concentration camps. Military operation manuals did not account for this scenario. Should all SS guards be treated as regular prisoners? Were they combatants or criminals? Every officer on the ground had to improvise decisions with immediate consequences. In several watchtowers, SS guards nervously watched movements within the camp. Some fired at prisoners approaching the fences, prompting immediate sniper responses from the Americans. These sporadic exchanges reinforced the perception that the surrender was incomplete and the threat persisted. Captain Leland Thompson, operations officer of the 42nd Division, found documents in the administrative office that showed recent orders to eliminate witnesses before the Allied arrival. A directive dated April 26th ordered complete evacuation and final cleaning, coded terms for mass murder. The awareness that a total massacre had been avoided by mere hours increased hostility toward the captured guards. General Linden requested urgent medical reinforcements and established a provisional command post. His initial report to the 7th Army headquarters was strikingly brief. Dachau camp secured. Critical humanitarian situation. Request all available medical resources, approximately 30,000 survivors, most in critical condition. Evidence of mass crimes, request instructions on processing captured SS personnel. The response from High Command came several hours later, by which time the events had already taken an irreversible course. This combination of factors, immediate visual horror, perceived threat, tactical confusion and lack of specific protocols, set the conditions for the events that would follow. Coal Yard, the massacre that no one wanted to tell. Among the multiple episodes of violence during the liberation of Dachau, the incident at the coal yard has been documented with particular precision thanks to the direct intervention of a senior officer and his subsequent testimony. It occurred at approximately 14:45 hours in an auxiliary area located at the rear of the main camp. This space, referred to in the reports as the coal yard, was a rectangular enclosure partially surrounded by brick walls, originally used for fuel storage. Due to an immediate tactical need, Colonel Felix Sparks had designated this area as a temporary concentration point for captured SS guards, while a formal protocol for their processing was being established. Lieutenant William P. Walsh, commander of Company 1 of the 157th Regiment, was ordered to guard the German prisoners gathered there. Approximately 50 members of the SS were led into the yard, where they were ordered to sit on the ground with their hands on their heads. Some wore full black uniforms. Others wore Wehrmacht uniforms or partially civilian clothes, showing attempts to hide their affiliation. To monitor this group, Walsh assigned an M1919A4 Browning machine gun operated by a young 19-year-old soldier, later identified in subsequent testimonies as Bird Eye. A small infantry detachment completed the security setup at both ends of the yard. Colonel Sparks personally supervised the area when he was urgently called to another sector where a group of prisoners required immediate medical attention. As he moved away, he gave explicit instructions. The German guard should be watched but not mistreated, as they were prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. Events quickly escalated minutes later. According to Walsh's later testimony, several guards began to move restlessly, seemingly communicating with each other in low voices. One prisoner suddenly stood up. A single shot was heard from the nearest watchtower, possibly from a German guard who had not yet surrendered, causing immediate confusion. The young gunner, interpreting these movements as an attempt to escape or rebel, opened fire with the machine gun without direct orders. The continuous burst swept across the group of seated prisoners, triggering a chain reaction. Some tried to stand up and run, others threw themselves to the ground, increasing the chaos. The shooter, apparently in a state of panic, continued firing indiscriminately. The sound of the machine gun alerted Colonel Sparks, who ran back to the yard. The scene he found was recorded in his report and subsequent statements. The young soldier, in an evident state of shock, continued firing on the fallen bodies while shouting incoherently. Sparks physically intervened, kicking the soldier out of his position and stopping the fire. "What I saw was a young man completely beside himself," Sparks would later declare years after. "He was crying and shaking, repeating that they were trying to escape. I had to forcibly remove him from the machine gun." On the ground lay 12 dead SS guards and at least 17 injured to varying degrees, some in agony. The colonel ordered immediate medical attention for the wounded and relieved the gunner, who was separated from his unit and examined by a military doctor. The preliminary diagnosis suggested a severe case of combat fatigue combined with acute psychological shock caused by exposure to the atrocities of the camp. Sparks reported the incident to General Charles Banfill, who arrived at Dachau hours later as a representative of the High Command. His description was straightforward. An unauthorized situation resulted in enemy casualties under custody. The responsible individual has been relieved. It was an isolated act without prior orders and contrary to our directives. This clarification would prove crucial in distinguishing this event from a systematic policy. The initial investigation, conducted by officers from the Military Intelligence Service G2, concluded that indeed some prisoners had attempted to change positions, though without clear evidence of a coordinated escape attempt. It was determined that the shot from the tower had been the primary trigger that precipitated the reaction of the American gunner. In the official documents of the 157th Regiment, the event was recorded as a security incident with unauthorized use of lethal force. No formal disciplinary actions were recommended against the gunner, considering his psychological state and the extreme circumstances. This episode in the coal yard, despite its severity, represented only a fraction of the violent actions that took place that day. Its uniqueness lies in the precise documentation, the direct intervention of a senior officer to stop it, and the official recognition of its unauthorized nature. Justice without uniform, the reckoning at Dachau. While the coal yard incident was documented as an isolated event with identifiable individual responsibility, other acts of retaliation occurred simultaneously in different sectors of Dachau. These episodes, less structured but equally lethal, reflected a form of improvised justice where the line between military security and vengeance was dissolved under the emotional impact of the discoveries. Lieutenant William P. Walsh himself was involved in another incident recorded in the regiment's reports. After exploring the wagons with corpses, he captured 4 SS guards attempting to escape, mingled with civilian workers. In a deliberate act, he led them to one of the wagons where approximately 130 decomposing bodies lay. According to witnesses, Walsh forced the 4 guards to enter the wagon and remain among the corpses for several minutes. "I want you to know exactly what you've done," were his words, according to the testimony of Corporal Henry Wells. Afterwards, Walsh drew his service pistol and personally executed the 4 Germans inside the wagon. A soldier under his command delivered additional shots to their heads to ensure their deaths. This act, deliberate and calculated, fundamentally differed from the impulsive panic shown by the young gunner in the coal yard. It represented a conscious summary execution, justified by its perpetrator as an act of direct justice in the face of evident crimes. Walsh never denied his responsibility, though he was never subjected to disciplinary procedures. In another section of the camp near the crematorium, Sergeant Peter Gallery of the 42nd Division recorded in his personal journal how a group of liberated prisoners identified a particularly brutal capo responsible for selecting the sick for medical experiments. The prisoners surrounded him, no one intervened. They used tools from the metal workshop. It was extremely brutal, but none of us lifted a finger to stop it. It was justice, not revenge. These executions, carried out by prisoners with the tacit consent of US troops, represented another dimension of reckoning. Soldiers who had witnessed the extreme suffering of the inmates believed they had a legitimate right to identify and punish their tormentors. Lieutenant Jack Hallowell, medical officer of the 45th Division, described in a letter to his superior how he deliberately provided a captured Luger pistol to a Dutch Jewish doctor liberated from the camp. "He asked me for a weapon to protect himself. I gave him more than that. I gave him the chance to balance the scales, and he used it that same afternoon against 2 guards he personally recognized as responsible for selections in the infirmary." In the barracks, where thousands of prisoners were crammed together, groups of inmates with enough physical strength identified and pursued capos who tried to blend in among regular prisoners. These capos, prisoners who had agreed to collaborate with the SS in exchange for privileges, were often more hated than the German guards themselves for their perceived betrayal. Captain Marcus J. Smith, a medical officer, recorded, "We found at least 7 capo bodies showing signs of having been beaten to death with blunt objects. According to the prisoners, they were collaborators who had taken part in internal selections or stolen rations. The soldiers assigned to that sector allowed the prisoners to handle the matter on their own." Another form of summary executions involved captured SS guards in the watchtowers. Lieutenant Howard Buchanan recounted how a group of surrendered guards was lined up against an exterior wall and executed by an improvised squad. "No one gave the order, it just happened. We had all seen the ovens, we had all smelled the bodies. There was a tacit consensus that these men did not deserve the status of prisoners of war. The absence of specific directives significantly contributed to this situation. Military manuals established protocols for conventional prisoners, but there were no precedents for captures in extermination facilities. Each unit, each officer, improvised decisions based on their personal interpretation of applicable justice." Captain Howard Wilsey provided one of the most revealing testimonies in his personal correspondence. "I saw how my comrades captured an SS man who had tortured prisoners and then executed him coldly. God forgive me, but I witnessed it without any disturbance after knowing the actions that the SS beasts had committed against their prisoners." These summary executions, scattered throughout the complex during the first 24 hours, were never officially accounted for. Conservative estimates from later military investigators suggest that between 35 and 50 guards died under similar circumstances, while other sources raise the number to over 100, including executions carried out by prisoners. In his report to headquarters, General Linden used carefully ambiguous language. During the securing of the objective, approximately 300 hostile elements were neutralized in various operational circumstances. This phrasing allowed for both legitimate combat casualties and summary executions without making compromising distinctions. The first hours at Dachau represented a moral and legal breaking point for American forces. Soldiers trained to follow established combat rules found themselves in a scenario that transcended the known categories of war. What they witnessed was not simply a defeated enemy, but tangible evidence of an industrial system designed for human extermination. War crime or justified punishment? The silence of the High Command. After the European War ended, as the Nuremberg trials began to establish new legal categories for prosecuting mass crimes, the US High Command faced an internal dilemma: how to officially address the violent incidents that occurred during the liberation of Dachau. The administrative and judicial handling of these events would reveal both legal and political considerations with far-reaching implications. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, was almost immediately informed about the events. His first response, contained in a memorandum to the General Staff, used deliberately ambiguous language. "Our forces liberated and completed the clearing of the infamous Dachau concentration camp. Approximately 32,000 prisoners were freed, but 300 SS guards of the camp were quickly neutralized." This formulation allowed for multiple interpretations. The term neutralized did not distinguish between casualties in legitimate combat, deaths during escape attempts, or summary executions. It was a technically correct but intentionally vague description that avoided compromising categorizations while fulfilling the obligation to report. Simultaneously, Eisenhower ordered the conditions found to be thoroughly documented. Signal Corps photographers were instructed to meticulously record every aspect of the camp. Accredited journalists were immediately invited, and delegations from the US Congress were sent to Europe to witness the evidence of genocide. "So that in the future no one can say this didn't happen," Eisenhower explained, anticipating possible denials. This concentration of resources on documenting Nazi horror implicitly set the official priorities. Attention would be directed toward the crimes of the enemy, not the possible infractions committed by the liberating troops. It was a strategic and political decision, but it also reflected the impact Dachau had on the Allied chain of command. As photographs of skeletal prisoners and wagons filled with corpses circulated through military decision-making centers, the issue of summary executions was relegated to internal administrative channels. Colonel William Quinn, Chief of Intelligence of the 7th Army, ordered a discreet investigation entrusted to officers from the Military Legal Corps. This review, conducted between May and June of 1945, produced a classified report whose conclusions stated that, although executions of surrendered guards had indeed occurred and technically constituted violations of the laws of war, in light of the conditions that greeted the first combat troops, it is not considered that justice or fairness demands undertaking the difficult and perhaps impossible task of assigning individual responsibility. Colonel Leon Jaworski, legal advisor to the 7th Army and later special prosecutor during the Watergate scandal, supported this conclusion. In a memorandum addressed to General George Patton, then commander of the 3rd Army, he argued that prosecuting American soldiers for acts committed in these circumstances would set a dangerous precedent, undermining the moral authority needed to judge Nazi criminals. This assessment reflects the complex considerations of the moment. The Nuremberg trials were being planned. The United States was assuming a position of moral leadership to judge Nazi crimes. A public acknowledgement of summary executions by American troops could compromise this position and provide material for enemy propaganda. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of the 7th Army, supported the administrative closure of the case. His decision, recorded in a brief memorandum, stated, Recognizing the lack of precedent for the situation encountered and the extreme pressure on the personnel involved, the opening of judicial proceedings is not justified. The matter is considered closed administratively. This decision was discreetly communicated through the chain of command without formal announcements or public statements. In fact, until the late 1980s, the official position of the Department of Defense on any questions regarding executions at Dachau was that there were no official records of such incidents. Colonel Sparks maintained an official silence about the events for years. In his operational report, he did not explicitly mention executions, using terms such as security incidents and unauthorized use of force. It was not until 1989, in interviews for the U.S. Army Military History Center, that he openly acknowledged the facts, though he always emphasized their unplanned nature and his intervention to stop them. The absence of formal judicial proceedings did not imply complete inaction. Several soldiers involved in the executions were discreetly transferred to other units. The machine gunner from the coal yard was removed from active duty and sent for psychiatric evaluation. Officers such as Walsh were reassigned to administrative duties far from the front, although they retained their ranks and did not face courts-martial. The War Department handled the situation as an internal security matter, not as a criminal case. In the official records, German casualties were listed under general categories such as neutralized during objective securing or shot in operational circumstances, without distinguishing between legitimate combat and summary executions. Dachau: Forgotten Testimonies and the Trauma of the Liberators. April 29, 1945 left a dual historical imprint: the public revelation of one of the most emblematic concentration camps of the Nazi regime and the controversial actions that marked its liberation. The evolution of how these events have been documented, archived, and reinterpreted over 7 decades reveals profound changes in the historical understanding of the Holocaust and military conduct in extreme situations. The immediate testimonies were captured in private correspondence and personal records that remained hidden for decades. Captain Howard Wilsey, a military physician present that day, maintained an extensive correspondence with his wife in which he described not only the medical conditions encountered, but also his perception of the executions he witnessed. "I cannot judge the men who fired," he wrote in May 1945. "There is something about this place that transforms human understanding. I've seen our soldiers die in combat, but nothing compares to the thousands reduced to living skeletons piled like disposable objects. This is not a site of war. There is no proper name for what it is." This personal correspondence, along with photographs, medical notes, and clinical observations, would later form the Howard C. Wilsey collection, preserved at the Seattle Holocaust Center. Wilsey's documents are particularly valuable for their clinical approach. He meticulously recorded weights, measurements, and vital signs of survivors, creating one of the first systematic medical records on concentration camp victims. While personal testimonies captured individual impressions, official documents followed a different path. Regulatory reports documented the liberation as a successful military operation, emphasizing the number of prisoners freed and the conditions encountered. The summary executions were coded as security incidents or special control situations. This divergence between personal archives and official records marked the first stage in the construction of historical memory about Dachau, a fork in the road where lived experience and institutional narrative began to separate, creating parallel and at times contradictory currents. It was not until the late 1980s, with most direct participants already retired or deceased, that more complete documentation began to emerge. In 1989, Felix Sparks gave an interview to the Military History Center in which, for the first time, he openly described the shooting in the coal yard and his intervention to stop it. "We must understand that our soldiers were not machines," he explained. "They were ordinary young men confronted with something so aberrant that no training could prepare them. What happened was terrible, but it wasn't planned or systematic. These were human reactions to the inhuman." This interview marked a turning point. For the first time, a senior officer officially acknowledged the summary executions, while emphasizing their unauthorized nature and the intervention to stop them. The recording was incorporated into the Library of Congress archives and later included in the Veterans History Project. In 1995, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the liberation, the Department of Defense declassified more than 1,200 pages of documents related to Dachau. This opening provided historians with access to military, medical, and communication reports that confirmed controversial aspects of the story previously omitted from the official account. The gradual opening of archives coincided with a significant generational shift. As direct participants reached advanced age, many felt the need to testify, to leave a record of experiences they had kept silent for decades. Between 1990 and 2005, dozens of veterans who had taken part in the liberation gave recorded interviews, offering new perspectives and details. John Lee, a soldier from Company 1 who witnessed the shooting in the coal yard, described in a 1998 interview with the Shoah Foundation, "The guy on the machine gun was completely out of control. He was crying while he fired. It was like he couldn't stop. Sparks literally had to kick him off the position. No one had ordered him to shoot. It was a moment of collective madness, something you can't understand unless you saw what we found there." These late testimonies, more sincere and detailed, allowed for the reconstruction of aspects omitted in official reports. They also revealed the depth of psychological trauma experienced by the liberating troops, a crucial factor in understanding their actions. In the academic field, researchers such as J. Michael Wenger, Richard Drinan, and Timothy Walsh began specifically addressing the incidents of reprisal, analyzing them as complex phenomena at the intersection of military history, trauma, psychology, and ethics in extreme situations. Wenger, author of Dachau, The Harrowing of Hell, published in 2002, was one of the first to use the term Dachau massacre to refer specifically to the summary executions, not the liberation as a whole. His research highlighted the absence of official orders for such acts while acknowledging understandable psychological patterns in the face of unprecedented atrocities. This categorization generated academic debate. Some military historians argued that the term massacre implied institutional intent, while others defended its use for events that, though unplanned, involved the deliberate execution of individuals in custody or who had surrendered. The term began to appear regularly in academic publications starting in 1990, initially in specialist journals such as Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the Journal of Military History, and later in reference works on World War II. Its usage reflected a significant shift in historiographical approach, from initial omission to explicit, though contextualized, recognition of controversial aspects. The case of Dachau was gradually incorporated into studies on transitional justice and military psychology in extreme situations, becoming a paradigmatic example of the ethical dilemmas faced by regular troops upon discovering mass crimes. Its analysis began to appear in academic programs on military history, combat ethics, and trauma psychology. The perspective of Jewish survivors on these events has been relatively underdocumented compared to military testimonies. Daniel Beanstalk, a Polish Jewish prisoner liberated that day, gave one of the few explicit statements on the subject during a 1997 interview. "We saw some American soldiers executing SS guards. None of us intervened or felt compassion. For those of us who had seen our companions systematically die over the years, it seemed barely a glimpse of justice. I remember a Russian prisoner next to me said, 'It's too quick. They should suffer like we suffered.' That was the general feeling." Rachel Abramovitz, a Romanian survivor, added another significant nuance. "The soldiers who shot the guards did so after seeing the ovens, the wagons, our emaciated bodies. They reacted like normal human beings to something abnormal. We had been dehumanized for so long that we could no longer react. That is perhaps the difference. They still retained the capacity for outrage that had been taken from us." These survivor testimonies add a crucial dimension to the ethical analysis of the events. They suggest a perspective in which the actions of the American soldiers are seen not as criminal excesses, but as understandable human reactions to the discovery of an inhuman system. While not a legal justification, they offer significant moral context. In commemorative terms, the evolution was also significant. The first official ceremonies at Dachau during the 1950s and 1960s exclusively emphasized the liberation as a heroic act, without any mention of controversial incidents. The memorial site, established in 1965, focused entirely on Nazi crimes and the suffering of the victims. It was not until the early 21st century that the commemorative plaques and informational materials at the memorial began to include nuanced mentions of the complex circumstances of the liberation. In 2005, during the 60th anniversary, an additional plaque acknowledged that, in the context of the horror discovered, unauthorized acts of reprisal occurred which, although understandable in their human context, reflect the profound moral destabilization caused by the Nazi system. The historian Paul Bourbon, in his definitive work Dachau, The Official History, provided one of the most balanced analyses of the events of April 29th. His research, based on interviews with survivors and declassified official documents, established a detailed chronology that integrated both the humanitarian aspects of the liberation and the violent incidents. Bourbon concluded that these acts, although contrary to military law, must be understood in their specific context. The immediate psychological impact of discovering a system of unprecedented industrialized horror in Western military experience. In the archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., photographs from the Army Signal Corps documenting the liberation are preserved alongside oral testimonies from veterans who participated in it. This juxtaposition allows researchers and visitors to directly confront the multiple dimensions of the event, including its most difficult aspects. The gradual incorporation of these events into official historical memory can also be observed in internal documents of the United States Army. Until the 1980s, training manuals on military law and combat ethics omitted any reference to Dachau, but later publications began to include it as a case study, precisely to examine the ethical complexities of extreme situations. An instructional document from the U.S. Army War College, dated 1998, explicitly presents the case. The incidents at Dachau demonstrate how even disciplined troops can react unexpectedly to discoveries that transcend their training, not as a justification but as a warning for future operations in scenarios where mass atrocities may be encountered. This evolution reflects a fundamental shift in the institutional understanding of combat behavior in extreme conditions. Where there was previously a tendency to silence or minimize transgressions, a gradually emerging approach now recognizes the psychological complexity of the soldier exposed to scenarios that fundamentally challenge their moral frameworks. Contemporary military historians such as David Cesarani and Christopher Browning have placed the events at Dachau in a broader context of systemic moral collapse that characterized the final months of the European War. Cesarani, in his work Final Solution: The Fate of the Jews, 1933 to 1949, argues that the liberation of concentration camps represented a unique moment where two distinct moral systems overlapped: the regulated framework of conventional military law and the visceral response to discoveries that transcended any prior preparation. Conclusion. The liberation of Dachau on April 29, 1945, transcends the simple categories with which historical narratives are often constructed. It was not merely a heroic rescue episode, nor can it be reduced to the excesses committed during its execution. Its complexity lies precisely in the coexistence of both dimensions, the saving act that returned freedom and dignity to thousands of human beings, alongside the transgressive violence that emerged as an immediate response to the horror discovered. The American troops who entered Dachau that spring Sunday were not substantially different from those who had fought through France, Belgium, or Italy. They were common young men, products of a society at war, trained to face conventional combat situations. However, their military training did not include protocols for the discovery of extermination camps. No operational manual, no psychological training could adequately anticipate the impact of the wagons filled with corpses, the crematory ovens, the mass graves, or the thousands of human beings reduced to living skeletons. This preparatory void, combined with the immediate emotional impact, created the conditions for a response that overwhelmed the anticipated institutional channels. It was not a planned policy, nor did it respond to higher orders. It was an emerging reaction, primarily individual or from small units, to a scenario that seemed to suspend conventional moral and legal categories of war. The shooting in the coal yard, the summary executions by the wagons, the handing over of weapons to prisoners to execute their torturers, these events all took place in the context of a profound psychological impact, a collective trauma witnessed in real time. The soldiers who participated in these acts did not perceive them then as war crimes or legal violations, but as direct and immediate responses to an evil that transcended any prior conceptual framework. The official position later adopted by the US military command, administratively closing the cases without formal judicial procedures, reflected both practical considerations and an implicit recognition of the exceptional nature of the circumstances. The central argument, expressed in internal memos, was that these acts, although technically contrary to military law, could not be properly evaluated outside the extreme context that provoked them. This stance can legitimately be interpreted from multiple angles: as a capitulation in the face of institutional responsibility, as a realistic recognition of unprecedented circumstances, or as a strategic decision to preserve the moral authority necessary in the trials against Nazi criminals. It likely contains elements of all these dimensions. Dr. Sidney Phillips, a military psychiatrist who evaluated several soldiers present at Dachau, described a recurring pattern. These men experienced what we might call a moral overload. Their value system, built on clear distinctions between right and wrong, between legitimate combatants and non-combatants, between just war and crimes, collapsed in the face of evidence of an evil that transcended these categories. This psychological interpretation does not justify every individual act, but it provides a framework for understanding why well-trained and disciplined soldiers participated in or allowed acts that, under other circumstances, they would have condemned. Historian Deborah Lipstadt has pointed out that Dachau represents a unique moment where two seemingly incongruent realities converged: the saving mission and the vindictive response. We cannot fully understand the liberation of Dachau if we insist on a purely heroic or exclusively critical narrative, she argues. The historical truth lies precisely in the tension between both dimensions, in the coexistence of the deepest compassion for the victims and the vengeful rage toward the perpetrators. This complexity explains why institutional memory took decades to incorporate the more controversial aspects. During the immediate post-war period, when foundational narratives about the United States' role in the defeat of Nazism were being constructed, it was problematic to acknowledge actions that could even superficially be equated with the crimes of the enemy. The image of the heroic, morally spotless liberator was essential for the emerging national identity in the context of the Cold War. Only over time, when the moral legitimacy of the fight against Nazism was firmly established, was it possible to gradually incorporate the nuances and complexities that characterized episodes like the liberation of Dachau. This process reflects a broader historiographical maturation, the transition from simplified narratives, constructed to serve immediate political needs, to more complex analyses that recognize the contradictions inherent in human experience under extreme conditions. The figure of Colonel Felix L. Sparks embodies the contradictions and complexities inherent in this episode. The same officer who physically intervened to stop the shooting in the coal yard was the one who decided not to report other similar incidents in his official report. The same military man who prevented a larger massacre was the one who argued decades later against judicial proceedings, maintaining that there was no proper framework to judge actions taken in those circumstances. In his person coexisted respect for military law and the recognition of situations that seemed to transcend it. The subsequent trajectory of Sparks is equally revealing. After the war, he studied law and developed a distinguished career as a judge in Colorado, where he gained a reputation for his strict adherence to legal procedure and his defense of procedural guarantees. This apparent contradiction, the man who had allowed certain legal transgressions in Dachau becoming a scrupulous guardian of the rule of law, illustrates the complex interaction between exceptional circumstances and normative principles in human conduct. For the survivors of Dachau, the issue of summary executions always took a secondary place to the central fact of their liberation. Max Mannheimer, a Jewish prisoner who survived the camp and later became a chronicler of the Holocaust, expressed a position shared by many. "What happened to the SS guards that day belongs to another moral order that I cannot judge. For us, those of us who were inside, the only relevant thing was that the moment finally came when the doors opened and we were considered human beings again. Eli Klein, a Hungarian survivor who arrived at Dachau on evacuation transports during the last weeks of the war, offered an equally significant perspective in his later memoirs. When the Americans opened the doors, I was too weak to move. I saw from my bunk how some soldiers treated the guards with extreme violence. At that moment, I felt nothing. Only days later, when I regained some strength and mental clarity, I began to reflect on what I had witnessed. I understood that those young soldiers, raised in a normal world with humanist values, had experienced a moral shock upon discovering what we had gradually lived through for years. Their violent response was a symptom of humanity, not of brutality. It was the reflection of souls who could still be outraged by absolute evil. This perspective from the direct victims should not be ignored when evaluating the events. It suggests that there is a moral hierarchy in historical interpretation. The systematic and organized crime of genocide cannot be equated with individual, even violent reactions to its discovery. However, this distinction does not exempt from critical analysis nor automatically justify any response. The writer and Auschwitz survivor Primo Levi, although he was not in Dachau, offered a relevant reflection on morality in extreme situations. The Shoah forces us to reconsider our conventional ethical categories, not to abandon them but to recognize their limits. There are conditions where ordinary moral frameworks are insufficient, not because they cease to be valid, but because they were conceived for situations that maintain some proportionality with normal human experience. The events at Dachau on that April 29th precisely represent that kind of extreme situation. Soldiers trained for a specific type of regulated violence, the conventional military combat, suddenly found themselves confronted with evidence of a completely different kind of violence, systematic and dehumanizing. Their response, although transgressive in some cases according to conventional military standards, must be interpreted within that specific context. This perspective does not seek to establish absolute moral relativism, but rather to recognize the insufficiency of decontextualized judgments. As philosopher Jonathan Glover has pointed out in his analysis of morality in extreme conflict situations, there are circumstances where people act under such extraordinary psychological and moral pressures that a different kind of evaluation is required, not to exempt responsibility, but to properly understand the nature of the actions and decisions made. Dachau remains a historical turning point for multiple reasons. For the world, it represented one of the first massive public exposures of the Nazi concentration system. For thousands of prisoners, it meant the end of an indescribable torment and the return to basic human dignity. For the liberating troops, it constituted a collective trauma that many would silently carry for the rest of their lives. The full story of that day does not allow for simplifications. There is no pure account of heroism without shadows, nor an abstract condemnation that ignores the extraordinary circumstances. Its deepest lesson may reside precisely in this complexity, in simultaneously recognizing the human capacity for the saving act and for vindictive transgression, for institutional discipline, and for cathartic rupture in the face of the incomprehensible. Understanding why the American soldiers shot the guards at Dachau does not imply justifying every individual action, but rather recognizing the fragility of our moral frameworks when confronting extreme manifestations of evil. It is an exercise that transcends simplistic judgment to delve into the complexities of human behavior in extreme situations. A reminder that even heroic acts may contain shadowy areas, and that history, to be honest, must harbor these ambiguities without resolving them artificially. Perhaps the most lucid reflection on these events comes from Samuel Glashow, one of the prisoners liberated that day. "I saw American soldiers crying in front of the piles of bodies. I saw others shooting at surrendered guards. I saw cruelty and compassion intertwined. How to judge this? I can only say that that day I visited both hell and its liberation, and both had a human face." The truth of Dachau does not reside exclusively in the horror discovered nor in the reactions it provoked, concludes historian Peter Longerich, but in the complex interaction between both elements. It is a reminder that even in the clearest moments of confrontation between good and evil, real human conduct rarely fits into simplified moral categories.